The Sandstorm Offensive began on a morning when the sun rose pale and distorted, as if it too feared what the desert was about to unleash. The wind had been restless all night, whispering through the dunes like a warning that no one wanted to hear, and by dawn the horizon was already bruised with a yellow-brown haze. Captain Amir Halim stood at the edge of the encampment, goggles hanging loose around his neck, watching the desert breathe. He had fought in cities where buildings bled concrete dust, and in mountains where snow could kill faster than bullets. But the desert was different. The desert did not rage, it endured, and when it struck, it did so with ancient patience. The order came without ceremony. At 0600 hours, the offensive would begin. The enemy had fortified the Al-Sharif corridor, a vital supply route cutting through hundreds of kilometers of open sand and rock. Intelligence suggested they were confident, too confident, that the coming sandstorm would ground aircraft, blind satellites, and force any sensible commander to delay. That confidence was the weakness command intended to exploit. The storm was not an obstacle, it was the weapon. Engines growled, half-choked by sand, and infantry units moved in tight formation, faces wrapped in cloth, rifles sealed and ready. The storm hit fully just as the first units crossed the line of departure. Visibility collapsed to a few meters, the world shrinking into a swirling tunnel of noise and grit. Sand clawed at skin and optics alike, found its way into joints, teeth, thoughts. Orders were shouted, then relayed by hand signals when voices vanished into the roar. The storm erased rank, erased distance, erased certainty. All that remained was movement. The enemy never saw them coming. Outposts along the corridor were manned by soldiers huddled against the storm, convinced that no attack could come in such conditions. When the first explosions tore through their forward defenses, confusion spread faster than fire. Sensors failed, communications dissolved into static, and commanders struggled to understand how an entire assault force had materialized out of nothing. By the time they realized this was no probing attack, but a full-scale offensive, it was already too late. Captain Halim's unit advanced through a ravine choked with drifting sand, guided by preloaded maps and instinct. Every step forward felt like defiance against nature itself. Tracer rounds flashed briefly, swallowed almost instantly by the storm, and the crack of gunfire sounded distant, unreal. In the chaos, Halim saw one of his soldiers stumble, struck by shrapnel. There was no time for hesitation. The offensive demanded momentum, and momentum demanded sacrifice. As the hours passed, the storm grew worse, yet the attack grew stronger. Supply drones, designed for calm skies, lay useless, so soldiers carried what they needed on their backs. Tanks fired blind, trusting coordinates rather than eyes, their shells carving thunder through the sand. The desert itself seemed to conspire with the attackers, masking their numbers, swallowing their tracks, turning every maneuver into a phantom threat. By late afternoon, the Al-Sharif corridor was fractured. They spoke of shadows moving through the sand, of attacks coming from impossible directions, of a force that did not fight the storm but wore it like armor. When the final defensive position collapsed, there was no triumphant cheer, only exhaustion and a quiet, shared understanding of what had been endured. When the storm finally began to die, it did so slowly, like a beast settling back into sleep. The sky cleared in ragged strips of blue, revealing a battlefield reshaped by wind and war. Vehicles stood half-buried, dunes smoothed over craters, and the desert already worked to erase the evidence of what had happened. Captain Halim removed his goggles and looked across the corridor they had taken. It was just sand and road and silence now, but he knew the truth would travel far beyond this place. The Sandstorm Offensive would be studied, analyzed, and retold as a masterstroke of strategy, a lesson in turning nature into an ally. But for those who fought it, it would always be remembered differently, not as a victory carved in maps and reports, but as a day when men and women walked willingly into blindness and fury, trusting one another more than sight itself, and emerged on the other side changed, carrying the desert with them long after the sand had fallen from their boots.